On October 20th, 2012, the Walt Disney Company acquired the rights to Star Wars from George Lucas. Since then, Disney has produced a constant stream of new movies, TV shows, comic books, novels, and video games that are all part of a shared universe. Before anything new could be made, however, Disney made the decision that any previous media created outside of the core movies would not be carried over to the new projects. For better or worse, over 20 years of interconnected expanded universe stories would remain as their own separate continuity. Gone, though not entirely forgotten, they would simply remain as legends. This is Tales from the Old New Republic, where we examine the Star Wars Legends canon, one novel at a time. Welcome to the second episode of Tales from the Old New Republic. I'm Eric.
And I'm Chris.
And today, we are covering the second novel in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Trilogy, Dark Force Rising. This book was released in May 1992 and takes place in 9 ABY, which is 5 years after Return of the Jedi. As always, we will try to keep Legend spoilers confined to just this book, but any movies or shows are fair game, especially if someone like Thrawn or a certain Chandrilan senator with a leadership position in the New Republic happens to appear in them. So, we're back. It's been a little bit, but we're starting the look at the second book in the Thrawn Trilogy. I know we started with a lot of the sort of production and publishing history last time, but basically everything we said still applies, so if you need a refresher of that, go listen to the previous episode. If you haven't listened to the previous episode, this one's probably going to be pretty confusing because it covers all the events of Heir to the Empire. If that's too long for you, you can also just read the Wikipedia summary of Heir to the Empire, and that'll probably have you covered. Like I said before, I've read these books a lot over the years, but I'll be honest, I didn't really remember Dark Force Rising that much. Compared to the first and third books in this trilogy, it all kind of is a blur for me. So I was going in with relatively fresh eyes on this. I know you mentioned you read the trilogy once, I think, before. Did you have any memories of this, or was it all just a completely blank slate?
Yeah, I have no recollection of anything that happens in this book. So in a way, it was great because it felt like I was reading it for the first time. But yeah, pretty forgettable in a lot of ways, just because it doesn't distinguish itself that much from the other two. But yeah, I am excited to see where the third one goes now. Piqued my interest. All right. In this episode, we're going to summarize each section of the book, and then we're going to talk about our different observations from each section. And then at the end, we're going to give our overall reactions to the book.
So, picking up from where we left off last time, where Admiral Akbar had just been arrested for treason, let's get started with Dark Force Rising. On Merkur, Thrawn's forces raid Karrde's abandoned base. Karrde, Mara, and his crew monitored the assault from behind an asteroid to ensure that there is no evidence that could point Thrawn towards their next destination. Thrawn anticipates this and secretly sends a ship to investigate the asteroid while his forces begin the ground assault. Mara senses the impending ambush and starts the takeoff sequence for the wild Karrde, allowing them to escape to hyperspace before the Imperial forces close in. After the raid, Thrawn sends the top performers to Mount Tantus, which has become the standard procedure. Later, Thrawn attacks a shipping convoy while discussing with Pellaeon how they framed Akbar in order to sow discord among the New Republic. Thrawn assuages Pellaeon's worries about C'baoth going rogue, and they decide to visit Honoghr, the Noghri home planet, to give them one last chance to capture Leia and her unborn children. Karrde's group settles into their new base on Rishi. He asks Mara about her danger sense, but she deflects by asking about the warships that he had been keeping secret. Karrde reveals that years ago, the ship he was serving on accidentally jumped to the location of the Katana fleet, a legendary Old Republic fleet that had been lost before the Clone Wars. Thinking they were under attack, the ship fled, but Karrde realized what they had actually found and memorized the coordinates before erasing the ship's records. While walking around town, Mara notices that she is being followed. She pursues, but is ambushed and held at blaster point by a bounty hunter. She's able to use the Force to distract and shoot the hunter, but discovers that Thrawn has placed bounties on Karrde and his entire crew. As they move on to another base, the dreams start again for Mara. So, once again, we open with Thrawn in some sort of military exercise to get everybody sort of reintroduced to him. In this case, he's trying to storm Card's base on Mirkir after Card sort of betrayed him previously. And even though he's not expecting to find anything, he still is having his troops go through the full normal procedures of a ground assault because a lot of them don't have a ton of experience. So any opportunity to learn about what they're supposed to do, he's taking it. And he also, even though he doesn't expect to find anything, because he met Card and he studied his art and he just saw it up on the walls, he's pretty sure that Card is either sticking around to observe or has people observing the base. And so he's basing a lot of his judgments on this in this chapter. We get to see when the order to start the ambush actually happens that Pelion realizes after the fact. And we're still seeing this sort of, Holmes and Watson dynamic between the two of them, where Pelion's smart enough to sort of keep up with what's happening, but still has to sort of point out the smarter decisions that Thrawn made and has to have some things explained to him.
Yeah, I think the back and forth where Pelion is like thinking about something, he's confused by something, but he knows something's up. And then Thrawn is like, "You had a question for me, Captain?" And then they explain it and Thrawn goes through his thought process. I think it works really well in a written work. I think this obviously doesn't work very well on TV because you don't do really many inner monologues. But I think the Watson and Holmes comparison is great because that also started as a book. And I think, it just works really well in this medium.
Yeah, and I think, unless I'm wrong, those books are also sort of from the perspective of Watson in the same sort of way that Pelion is sort of the point of view character for a lot of these Thrawn scenes.
Another thing about Thrawn is when Card escapes, as usual, he's cool as a cucumber. And he's like, an interesting puzzle, because he doesn't understand how they managed to evade him. And I just really like this as a character moment because as much as he's sort of a zealot for the Imperial doctrine and everything, he's in it for the love of the game. Like, he likes the cat and mouse chase. He's focused on winning and he's not going to compromise that, but he can enjoy it too. And I found that just an enjoyable characteristic to read about.
The last thing that we get from this section is that the highest performers from the ground assault Thrawn has transferred to Mount Tantus, which is where Sabaoth was located on Wayland and has the Emperor's secret storage facility. So there's some other projects still happening on Mount Tantus even after they found the shield or the cloaking shield last time, and that mystery is going to sort of continue throughout this book. A little bit later, we see Thrawn ambush a supply line, and he notices that A-wings emerge from the New Republic forces that are guarding the supply convoy, and notes that this may be an impact of Borskphalia having more influence with the military and sort of taking charge of some of these operations. Though Thrawn does question the strategy of using A-wings for escort because their main strength is that they're faster, and that's kind of canceled out by having to stay close to the slower cruisers that are being guarded. But I did want to bring up something that has to do with the Rebel fighters. Are we supposed to assume that they're actually good warships compared to like the TIE fighters or TIE interceptors? Because they start talking about the sort of the strengths and weaknesses of X-wings versus A-wings, and even Pelion I think comments like, "Oh, yeah, these A-wings are really annoying. Like they're good ships that cause us a lot of trouble." But I know it's sort of developed that way now because a lot of like the video games you play as an X-wing or other rebellion ships, so those have to be pretty well outfitted. But it's kind of weird seeing the Rebels had to get their hands on them somehow, and I don't know how exactly that happens.
Yeah, you would think, I think in like a real world equivalent of this, the Rebels would have the broken down like old 1970s equipment, and the ruling force has the modern stuff. Yeah, I definitely think my brain has been so poisoned by the various video game incarnations that I just kind of naturally expect TIE fighters are cheap and crummy, X-wings and A-wings are these like elite fighters. But even in their visual design, like they look more like they're cobbled together pieces of junk. So yeah, I don't know like where they stood at this point, if the guidebooks were really pushing that narrative that the Rebel and New Republic equipment is like fewer in number but better in quality, or what. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting to see it without that sort of hindsight taint.
Yeah, and then the other sort of big thing we get while he's attacking here is he's just sort of casually having a conversation with Pelion that reveals that he was the one that planted the evidence to frame Akbar and get him arrested. And basically, the main reason he did that was because he knew Phalia would sort of make a power grab and sort of sow dissension among the New Republic. And he intentionally kind of made it not an airtight bit of evidence just so that you could have multiple sides sort of forming within the Republic arguing over Akbar. And he's able to monitor all of this because of something called Delta Source, which is his a source within Coruscant that only he knows the details on, but that's how he keeps getting information, like where Leia was going to go next and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and this keeps happening in the book where Thrawn just like casually reveals some other piece of the plan that someone else in the scene isn't aware of. And yeah, he's very committed to encapsulation or like revealing things on a need to know basis. And so it is funny to just have him like not even trust his closest confidant until after it's no longer a problem. And then, yeah, we again get a scene where Thrawn sort of lets the convoy escape with their lives. It's one of those things like, why are we letting them escape? And it's because he realizes the benefit that he doesn't need to fully destroy them. He needs to just make them scared enough that they're not sure where the next one's going to hit. And his explanation is economics and psychology, Captain. So he's trying to send a message that's going to alter their behavior and spread their lines thin. So, he doesn't just like waste TIE fighters and cruisers and things unless it has a greater purpose. And yeah, he's playing the long game here.
Yeah, I guess, it's important to remember that right now the Empire is still severely outgunned. Like, he only has a handful of Star Destroyers really to maneuver. So by just attacking a single convoy can't really do that much damage. But if he can sort of force them to guard every single convoy, that's a much bigger impact than anything he could do just with military force.
Right.
They also talk about Sabaoth a little bit, who's still hanging out on Jomark, doing his mind control thing with the local population like he was doing back on Wayland. And even though Pelion keeps saying, like, this is kind of a bad idea, he's kind of going crazy and he's uncontrollable, Thrawn isn't too worried about him because he thinks in the long run, Sabaoth is too erratic and unstable to plan a proper coup against him. I really have to question the logic of this, especially with some of the force powers we see Sabaoth display throughout this book that, I don't really think it matters how stable his mind is. Like, if he could throw a lightning bolt into space or something, it could really cause a lot of problems for him. So Thrawn's oddly dismissive of what Sabaoth can do.
Yeah, I felt that way too.
So speaking of Sabaoth, we get a little POV of him just waiting on Jomark, and it's sort of this stream of conscious, and you get to really get a close look into his mind. He is completely crazy already. His thoughts kind of wander all over the place. He has these mental blocks that anytime he starts trying to remember something particular from his past that doesn't make sense, it just stops him from thinking about that, and he forgets what he was thinking about anyways. He's trying to remember fighting the Dark Jedi guarding the Emperor's Mountain, and he's like, I can't even really remember what that guy looked like or what happened there. And it just sort of hops all over the place. But the main thing coming out is he really wants to get those Jedi students, and he's getting really annoyed with Thrawn. And all of this is pretty interesting because we didn't mention this last time, but in the first, or in an earlier draft of this trilogy, Sabaoth was actually going to be an evil Obi-Wan Kenobi clone that went kind of crazy. So I just have to wonder what this series would have been like having, especially a chapter like this with just nutso Obi-Wan, and how you would even try to write that kind of character.
Yeah, this feels like one of those, similar to how the last book was almost going to be called Wild Card, and you're like, what? No, that's way worse than what they ended up with. So I'm definitely happy that it's not an evil Obi-Wan. Like, none of the setup and intrigue, and Luke would have no reason to be like, I wonder if I should give evil Obi-Wan clone a shot. Like, it just totally doesn't make sense in that context.
Yeah, editors are important.
Yeah.
as also evidenced by the prequels. We head over with Card and Mara on Rishi, where they're getting settled in, and oh my god, they killed Dengar.
Yep, Dengar's dead, guys.
So Dengar is the bounty hunter that ambushes Mara and that she shoots in the face, and then we find out it's Dengar because she pulls out his wallet afterwards and he's got a Dengar ID on him. So we know that there's the rule about no killing off major characters for this book. That was something that was imposed upon Zahn. So the question is, does the fourth most popular bounty hunter from the lineup in Empire Strikes Back meet the requirement for major character that shouldn't be killed off? Apparently, Lucasfilm thought that he was popular enough and needed to survive, because his death gets retconned after this in the West End Games sourcebook, so the tabletop RPG sourcebook tie-in for the Thrawn Trilogy. They reveal that Dengar Roth, or who we thought was Dengar Roth, was actually a different bounty hunter named Gunnar Groth, who liked to impersonate Dengar because he was able to charge more for his bounty hunting.
Yeah, I think this really sets a dangerous precedent for these Legends books. I mean, I haven't read a lot of them, but the fact that we can't even kill Dengar, we're really constraining ourselves on what characters can and can't be killed, and I feel like that's going to kill some of the tension later. You know, these books do a decent job of introducing new characters, and it's good that they can kind of play with them with low stakes for the broader canon, but yeah, I don't think anybody would have been super upset about that guy that has no lines and nobody refers to and maybe isn't in the credits, or is he? I don't know. Probably not in the script. Like, I think it's fine. We could have lived without it.
That sort of approach becomes even more complicated, where once you start having a bunch of EU novels with new characters being introduced, other authors also don't want to touch other authors' characters. So, you know, like Card, right? He gets introduced in this book, and if he appeared in some other book later, nobody's going to feel comfortable killing off Cards. So the only real candidates to die in a lot of these books are the characters that are introduced in that book, which leads to sort of some, like, you know, Star Trek red shirting with some of the characters that get introduced.
Right. Didn't Dengar come back in the sequels? Isn't that one of the bounty hunter? Like, isn't he the guy that? Oh, man.
In which movie?
I think in The Rise of Skywalker, which I've only seen once, the like evil bounty hunter with the Sith dagger, I think was retconned to be Dengar. And then does he die? I don't remember. My point is, they had no qualms. They were just like, what if this is Dengar? What if we kill him? What if, like, I mean, they didn't care at all. They
unceremoniously blow up Admiral Akbar in the second one. So,
that's right. Yeah.
In Last Jedi. So, yeah, I don't think they cared as much, which, I mean, yeah, I feel like it's better that you can actually touch all these characters, especially somebody as lowly as a good old Dengar here.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely a middle ground between killing them off screen versus like making sure that they're never touched and they stay exactly how you remember them in Empire Strikes Back. Like,
yeah, it's such like a comic book thing to me, where, you know, they kill off a character and then the next author comes in and is like, actually that was a clone or something. You know, whoever it is still alive.
Speaking of mentions and name drops, so the planet Rishi stood out to me because that is, I believe, there's like the Rishi moons are where Echo and Fives were stationed in their first appearance in the Clone Wars TV show. And yeah, it's just funny to see these names kind of still being used this much later, you know, however many years after that book came out, over 10 years after.
Yeah, every time I see a name I recognize here, it's like, oh, that's where that came from. Yeah.
Yeah. We're not going to be able to mention all of them, but this one stood out to me as the first one in the book, like right off the bat. So there are probably more that we're not going to mention. But yeah. So then we get some introduction to the Katana fleet, which is all of the dreadnoughts. And what immediately stood out to me was how labor intensive these ships are. I mean, like they mentioned that the crew size is 16,000 people, which is just absurd. I get that, like, when you have thousands of planets in a galaxy, then and like each planet has populations in the millions or billions. Like, yeah, okay, there are physically enough people, but like just conceiving of putting that many people on a single starship in a fleet, it's just silly. I mean, I don't know.
Also, so is it like 15,500 are just working on the engines or something, like,
Right.
or like our janitors? Like, what's the breakdown here?
Yeah.
And it's not like dreadnoughts are even like Star Destroyer sized cruisers, right? Like they're sort of like medium sized warships, so it's not this thing the size of New Hampshire that's flying through space. It's a like a reasonably sized ship.
Yeah, and even with things like Star Destroyers, a big portion of their number total is all of the stormtroopers, all of the fighter pilots, all of the whatever. Like, I don't know that, like, they imply that dreadnoughts require 16,000 people to operate, whereas Star Destroyers, you assume, yes, there is like a large number of engineers and maintenance people and whatever officers, but like you don't need the stormtroopers to fly the ship. But here it's sort of implied that you do.
Yeah, and so the reason the Katana fleet is lost in space is that it was designed so there was one sort of command ship, and then all of the other ships in the fleet could sort of hook up to that master ship, and it could sort of give remote instructions, and then an accident happens and they all get jumped to the same sort of indeterminate place in hyperspace. And they note that after this incident, the Old Republic caused a move towards decentralization from a central computer and shifting all of that burden on to droids, which just kind of made me think of Dune and how, you know, turning everything over to droids for space flight is just asking for a Butlerian jihad to happen at some point in the future. But the thing that really struck me about this is that you see sort of like a technology jump in a 50-year time span that's sort of similar to the technology jumps that we get in real life, you know, from like the 1950s to now, say. And when you look at Star Wars, where it's like the Old Republic's been around for thousands of years and had space flight, how much innovation is happening in technology? I feel like, especially when we start looking back to, you know, prequel stuff where they still have spaceships, everything still basically functions exactly the same. At least in this book, it's, you know, when you talk about stuff from the Clone Wars, it's like, oh, that's old garbage technology. You know, that's the iPhone 1 compared to the, you know, iPhone 500 that we have now.
Yeah, I mean, and I think totally right that like the movies, all of them, the prequels through the sequels, all do this where you feel an Earth commensurate level of technological improvement. Yeah, the the time scales just don't make sense. But who knows? I mean, maybe it's so abstract at that point, like it's so broadly spread across the galaxy that like people have kind of lost touch with how any of the technology works, and so like there is lots of room to discover new things because the average person like doesn't contribute meaningfully to the advancement of technology. I don't know.
Maybe it's just like cyclical, where they're not really making anything new. They're just kind of like switching to different sort of equally complex technology that just happens to be different because some incident like this happens. So everybody moves to droids instead of a centralized computer, but there's nothing necessarily like more advanced about using droids versus the supercomputer.
That's true. I guess that's true in like software development circles, right? Like people keep rediscovering old software development patterns, and then the whole industry shifts to some new thing, and then they say, oh, that's dead, we're starting this other thing, and it's just a repeat of something that was invented like in the 60s. So yeah, I could see that too. Yeah, and then they mentioned that the crew of the Katana was killed by this so-called hive virus, which causes everyone to go crazy and die. This, obviously this is not a real thing, but there was still like some kind of canon explanation given in the Legends universe that it was created by a guy called Zeta Magnus, from Sky with an E, Skywalker's a Clone Wars story, published in the official fan club newsletter ? Like, yeah, I don't know. There's some weird backstory to this thing that was sort of just thrown in as a narrative device for this one book.
Yeah, I think it was like commissioned to include in this in this fan club newsletter, if I remember reading the wiki article properly. But it is included on Wikipedia as part of Legends canon, so we will treat it as such. That this Transformer name guy invented the Hive virus to do something, and then that's what caused the Katana fleet to get lost back in the Old Republic.
Yep, classic Zeta Magnus move.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to point out that the Katana fleet gets lost sort of in the undetermined hyperspace between planets, and it was because of the slave circuits that the whole fleet was hooked up to with that master control ship. And both of these things are elements that were introduced in Heir to the Empire. So we had Luke getting lost in hyperspace when he's attacked by Thrawn, and then when Han and Leia first arrive at the mining planet Niklon, and they have to fly with a shield ship because it's so close to the sun. Han mentions that the Millennium Falcon doesn't have a slave circuit that would allow the shield ship to sort of remote pilot, like cruise control the Millennium Falcon and with it. So Han has to manually fly it for like a full day or something. But just wanted to point out that they foreshadowed these in the previous book to just get us sort of aware of the concepts of getting lost in hyperspace or remotely controlling other ships before it gets introduced for the main reason with the Katana fleet. And I guess just a final note on this is that Card is very steadfast about not giving up the dreadnoughts to Thrawn, even though they find out that Thrawn is offering like well above market price for any warships, and this would be a way to get him off their back and make a ton of money. But he's saying, I don't want to have to make this trade from a disadvantaged position, and he's still sort of viewing everything as transactional and as a businessman. At least he's claiming. It also may be that he is a bit more sympathetic to the New Republic than he wants anybody to know. While he's talking to Mara, though, as soon as he mentions it, the gears start turning in her head because she still kind of has these uncertain feelings about the Empire and the New Republic, and this seems like a more reasonable path for her, that they could use this fleet to escape from Thrawn. And this section is kind of where we start really getting into Mara's character. She doesn't really view Thrawn in this new Empire as the same thing as the old Empire that she was, serving the Emperor in. So she doesn't exactly know how to feel. We also start finding out about some of her Force abilities. So when the Emperor died, she completely lost the ability to use the Force. And within the last couple years, it started to come back, but it's not consistent. And basically, the powers will come, the powers will go away sort of at random. But when they do come, she starts having nightmares about the Emperor and nightmares about Luke. And so now that she sees that her powers are coming back and that she had the Force premonition to help them escape, she knows that the dreams are soon to follow.
Han returns to Coruscant after the Battle of Sluis Von, but Luke is stuck there waiting for his X-Wing to be repaired while Lando receives medical treatment. When Luke visits Lando recognizes the scent of smoke from cigars used by the famous ship thief Niles Ferrier, and realizes that Ferrier intends to use the chaos of the battle to steal Republic warships. They investigate and are ambushed by Ferrier's crew. Luke is able to fight them off until Lando negotiates a ceasefire. He convinces Ferrier to leave the system in exchange for not turning him in, and to hand over the codes he used to slice into Sluis security, which Lando then uses to move Luke's X-Wing to the top of the repair list. On Coruscant, Han meets with Leia and Chewbacca and learns about cyber attacks on several banks and a large untraceable sum that was deposited into Akbar's account. Akbar is also being blamed for moving New Republic ships to Sluis Von where they were vulnerable. Bothan Senator Borsk Phalia capitalizes on the situation to slowly gain more political and military power, while hinting that Akbar's mistake could have been intentional. Han is questioned by Mon Mothma and her council about the Sluis Von attack, but his mention of a new Grand Admiral is met with skepticism. Han and Leia visit Akbar to catch him up, and he is more receptive to the possibility. After Luke gathers information on Sabaoth on Coruscant, he discusses Phalia's power play with Han and Leia. Han identifies the planet Nukov as a potential starting point for investigation based on the Bothans' defense of it during the war. Han and Leia clash over her decision to visit the Nogri homeworld, but she's able to convince him that she needs to go. Chewbacca insists on accompanying her, and 3PO joins them on the Falcon as they head for Endor.
All right, so Luke and Lando are kind of stuck on Slace Vaughn right now because Han took the Millennium Falcon to get back to Coruscant immediately. And because Luke is no longer part of the military, he can't just requisition a new X-Wing to follow. So he's trying to get his X-Wing repaired. He gives Wedge a call and is asking for help. And Wedge even offers, like, hey, you could just take my X-Wing and go if it's really that important. And Luke is like, well, that'll probably get you court-martialed. Like, I don't think this is the best opportunity. But Wedge, throughout this entire book, just completely disregards any sort of military rules and just kind of does whatever he feels like. And Luke is sort of debating, well, I could use my reputation as a Jedi and the savior of the Republic to just, commandeer an X-Wing, but then maybe Phalia would say that, I'm abusing my power and that could be bad politically. But at the same time, maybe the fact that I could just walk into any New Republic base and just demand an X-Wing shows how powerful I am. And he's sort of going back and forth, and and he ultimately decides he just doesn't have the fortitude to make the political decisions like that. So like his master before him, he's just simply not brave enough for politics. And when Lando recognizes the scent of Niles Ferrier, Luke shows that he can do a full rewind of his memories using the Force, like Minority Report style, which is a new Force power and extremely useful. And I feel like after this doesn't ever really get used again.
Yeah, I think this is more fun in concept than it is in execution, because so many things could be resolved if you can literally just recall any memory at any time. And yeah, I don't think they use it again for the rest of the book. So yeah, and then the fact that like they come to an entire planet and he's just like, oh, this cigar reminds me of someone. He's here. Let's go find him. Like, that's insane. That shouldn't happen. Not on a whole planet. What are the odds?
And apparently he's the one person in the entire galaxy that uses these like flavored cigars or something. They're so recognizable that Lando just picks out the shift thief immediately. And he's not even in the vicinity. It's just like the lingering smoke that was on Luke is enough to send them into action immediately to track down Ferrier.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they get into the sort of this firefight with Ferrier's people. And the way it's resolved is Lando basically yells out, hey, I've got Luke Skywalker with me. He took down Darth Vader. Are you sure you guys really want to do this? And Luke thinks to himself, well, technically I didn't kill Vader. Like he died because he saved me from the Emperor. But yeah, I guess I'm okay with using that as an example or as a negotiating tactic. And in this fight, we meet one of Niles Ferrier's crew members, who is a Defel, which Ferrier calls a shadow wraith, and is described as a shape with absolute blackness. So Defels, they come from a planet where the atmosphere blocks all light except for UV, so they evolve in a purely ultraviolet environment, and their bodies absorb all visible light, which leaves them as this purely black image, though it fades as they age. So you can actually see a Defel in Mos Eisley is the wolf man with the glowing eyes in a shot in the cantina in A New Hope. So this book came out in 92, and this idea of absorbing all visible light was just a pure speculation at that point. But actually in 2014, a company developed a nanocoating that they called Vantablack that absorbs 99.97 of all visible light. And even if you just Google Vantablack and see things that are painted with this coating, it is like the darkest, purest color black that you could even imagine. Like, I don't even know if you see it in person, just how dark it is. So it's pretty cool that something that was sort of just a speculative fiction back in 92 was actually ended up being a real technology or a real color that was created with this nanocoating. But I like to point out that in this book, it's treated like the Wraith is almost cloaked because he absorbs all visible light, and they call it this absolute blackness. If you look at these images, there's nothing invisible about them. If anything, it stands out more because of just how like bold the the blackness is. And I guess the new canon agreed because they've now changed the explanation that light actually bends around the Defels. And so that's how they're sort of like these stealth creatures.
Yeah, when I found out that this character is supposed to be the Wolfman from Mos Eisley, no part of me watching A New Hope thought that this was the darkest black a human eye could possibly perceive, right? Like, he's just a wolf guy. So I don't understand why they felt the need to shoehorn an existing concept into this. They could have just come up with a new thing that's like, oh, this is a race that does shadow stuff. Because, like, the way they describe it and how I picture it in the book is literally like it's a shadow moving around on the ground. That's kind of how the comic book represents it, too. Yeah, I don't know what they're thinking incorporating it this way.
Moving on to Coruscant. When Han arrives, he gives testimony in front of Mon Mothma and the Inner Council, which includes Phalia, and basically nobody believes him about Thrawn because he just says that Thrawn has blue skin, and because of that, everybody assumes he's an alien, and there's no way that the Empire would elevate an alien to be a Grand Admiral. Phalia is really acting out during his testimony. You know, Mon Mothma's still the president, but she barely even gets a word in, and it's just Phalia, like, questioning every single thing that Han says. They really go out of their way to make Phalia as unlikable as possible. Han refers to him as a fuzzball, which kind of seems like a slur to me. I don't know.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, that's... I mean, Leia does the same thing when she's talking about Chewbacca at some point. But yeah, they definitely stereotype Bothans a lot in this book, saying things like, oh, well, you know, Bothans are known for their recon, or Bothans are known for this. And it's like, it's an entire planet. Like, is that really what all of them are known for? And it kind of plays into that whole thing about Thrawn studying different species art and being able to be like, oh, well, all Bothans do this, so that means I know that his ship is going to turn left when I fire at its bow or whatever.
Yeah, and like he studies Card's art so that he can predict Card, and Card is a unique human, so he has his own personality and his own tendencies. But if it's an alien, it's just, I've studied this alien race's art, and therefore I can predict every single member of that species.
Yeah, and then this testimony scene, just because I watched it somewhat recently, reminds me of a very similar scene in the Ahsoka TV show that may have been intentional, but they have their own little scene where they are trying to figure out, like, who's this Thrawn guy? Is he really dangerous? And yeah, it's just another case where modern Disney canon will incorporate sort of the superficial elements of this series, but without any of the same context. Like, that takes place after
Thrawn's already appeared at that. Like, he was there, and then he got taken away by space whales, but he was a pretty prominent figure during the rebellion, right?
Yeah, like his escapades are pretty well documented in the early parts of the rebellion, whereas in the book, like, literally nobody knows who he is. He just kind of shows up, which explains why everybody's skeptical. Whereas on the Ahsoka TV show, it's like, no, we all fought him. Like, I was there, you know, and they're still like, this is all just a made up hooey story. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, you've met him. And then just a couple things that came up. There are these two made up phrases. This is one of those things where, like, the anthropology of Star Wars is always a little weird, where they say, oh, well, he's playing his sabacc cards close to the fur. Like, instead of playing his cards close to the chest or something. It's like, Bothans still have chests, even though they have fur. And then there's another part, they're like, hey, we don't want to rock the stabilizers instead of rock the boat. Like, they have boats in Star Wars. Boats exist. You don't need a new phrase. So, I don't know. Same thing how people, like, Han said mumbo jumbo in The Force Awakens. That means mumbo jumbo is canon. And it's like, no. It's just a phrase. It doesn't mean anything. Like, I don't know. It's weird that they have to invent these little turn of phrases.
Yeah, it's language that's trying to make it seem more sci-fi and more within the universe, but it just kind of stands out more, like you mentioned, with the fur. Because do we only use that phrase when it's somebody with fur? They play the cards close to the fur, but if you don't have fur, then you just use cards close to the chest.
Yeah, and does he need to specify that they're sabacc cards? Like, we don't say he's playing his blackjack cards close to the chest, you know, like...
Yeah, it's the only card game other than Pazak, which was the card game in Knights of the Old Republic, which is similar but different than Sabak.
Yeah, it feels like something out of Rick and Morty making fun of characters that use like human phrases with an alien twist. Like,
Yeah,
you don't need to
like
do that.
bird person stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so while Leia is talking to Akbar afterwards, she and Han, they mention the Grand Admiral, and he's a bit more receptive to the idea. He says, oh, that would actually kind of explain all the troubles were happening if somebody as talented as a Grand Admiral is, commanding the Imperial forces now. And we learn a little more about what Grand Admirals are because, it's something new to these books. So they weren't just admirals that then received a promotion and got moved into the Grand Admiral position. They were handpicked by Palpatine and were sort of this special inner council that existed outside of the normal integrated military command and would be sort of his personal representatives in the military. And it's just sort of similar to what we saw with Mara as the Emperor's Hand, where even as Palpatine has become the Emperor and has, dissolved the Senate and has basically absolute authority, he's still creating these other systems to exert even more control. And he's like, I control the military. The Moths have taken over as governing all of the systems, and they all report up to me. But even with that, I want my own set of super admirals that can control more things.
I mean, it's cool, good for him. But yeah, it does seem kind of excessive when you already have admirals and could just make more admirals or something. During some of the back and forth about Akbar, we sort of learned that the Mon Calamari were a peaceful race until the Empire enslaved them, and their cruise ships, which you see all over the place in Return of the Jedi, were originally passenger carriers. And I believe a lot of this was established again in the West End Games guidebooks. But yeah, it's like pretty different from what we saw in the Clone Wars eventually, where they kind of were already this militant race. We don't really see their space flight much because their whole arc takes place underwater. But yeah, I don't know. It's just an interesting take on it. We're like, okay, I never really thought about them as selling passenger cruisers.
Maybe they were just selling, passenger ships, but the peaceful thing, I'm a little more skeptical on that because the Mon Calamari are not the only sentient race on Mon Cala, right? There's also the Quarren, and, I don't know exactly how much background existed on this, but I assume the West End Games probably had, info about the relations between the Quarren and the Mon Calamari. Basically their entire history, they sort of compete for control over Mon Cala. Quarren usually losing. In the Clone Wars episodes you were talking about, Mon Cal had a monarchy ruled by a Mon Calamari. So I don't know. The Quarren are always portrayed as sort of like the evil people on Mon Cala. They're the ones that sort of are more serious about joining the Separatists, and it's the claim, oh, we're very peaceful. We just kind of have this like second class citizen race that we fight with constantly, but that we're not violent or anything. They just keep rebelling for some reason. I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna go say hi to the king.
Yeah.
So once Luke gets back to Coruscant, he takes a look through the archives for information about Sabaoth, and we get this big info dump about Sabaoth's life in the Old Republic. Some of the things that stand out: he attended normal university and then started Jedi training at age 22, as opposed to what we see in the prequels where 8-year-old Anakin is too old to start training. He trained on a Jedi training center on Camparis, so there wasn't one centralized Jedi temple. It was sort of implied that they had little facilities all over the place. They also mentioned he started private training at one point, which predates the Padawan idea, but sort of laying the ground there. But the thing that really stands out is that Sabaoth was born in 112's pre-Empire, which We don't know exactly when the Empire started, but that probably is around 120 BBY, which would put him in, he's somewhere between like 130 and 150 years old if he was still alive. But basically, all the events listed here seem like they're way too old. And I know that Sabaoth dies, and that this one is a clone. But even the outbound flight seems to have happened a long time earlier. And they mentioned that he started working as an advisor for Palpatine in the Old Republic in minus 70 pre-Empire. So, it implies that Palpatine was around for 70 years before the Empire was formally established. And around that time, the whole Dark Jedi on Bafash thing that was mentioned in the last episode happened, which was supposedly during the Clone Wars, which, means it was like 50 years before Anakin was born. So either the Clone Wars went on for like 80 years or, everything is just kind of out of whack here.
Yeah, of all the things they could have committed to, I think hard timelines on when the Clone Wars started and ended was not the move, because for the reason you just said, that like Anakin, we know, is only old enough to have a like 20-year-old son. So he can't be that old. And yeah, it just really feels like the first book in the trilogy was very careful about not stepping on any pre-established canon or like potentially screwing up something for any future material that would be produced. And then this book, they're like, you know what, screw it, we're just going to do whatever we want. And he lays out this huge timeline of things. It's like, nope, all of this turned out to be totally wrong. But it
not even turned out, like, even with just knowledge of the original movies, some of these dates don't really make a ton of sense.
Like,
right?
They're possible, but they're not the first thing you would think of.
Like, is Palpatine supposed to be like 200 by the time Return of the Jedi happens?
Right, and that's why he's so wrinkly. I mean,
yeah.
But this is also the first time, I think, in the books that we get the name Palpatine. We would never be so lucky to get him called Sheev, but at the very least, it is funny to see it and be like, oh yeah, they've only been calling him the Emperor up to this point, and then all of a sudden they're just comfortable being like, oh yeah, he used to be called Palpatine because that was how everybody knew him. And it is interesting to see, like, we've been using that name pretty much the whole time because everybody knows what it means. Yeah, and then we also get a scene where Winter, who, if you remember, is Leia's like buddy from Alderaan, she remembers Sabaoth from like a photo in their old place wearing those brown and white robes that Jedi seem to favor. And this has been a point of contention for Star Wars fans for a long time, where like people are kind of upset in the prequels that the Jedi all dress like hermits from Tatooine, even though it was kind of assumed that the reason Obi-Wan and then eventually like old Anakin Skywalker as a ghost wear those robes is because they're from Tatooine or like lived there for some period, and that Jedi generally would wear things that Luke wears, which is more of like a modern jumpsuit. He still has like the hooded cloak and everything, but isn't dressed specifically like Tatooine fashion. And this book seems to imply, oh, no, they did actually wear all of those things. So for all of the crap that George Lucas gets for like screwing up what Jedi are supposed to wear, like people were doing this way before he made the prequels. So I just thought that was really funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's recognizable at least, yeah. Right? And I'd also say that the brown robe kind of doesn't make sense, but the white suit that like is underneath is sort of similar to like traditional samurai garb. So that portion of it kind of makes sense as a Jedi, that Jedi are basically space samurai.
Right. But I think the point being, it doesn't make sense that Obi-Wan would be hiding on Anakin's home planet dressed like a Jedi.
Yeah, that's the bigger issue. So yeah, with Sabaoth's age, Luke does wonder about it, but he doesn't discount Sabaoth being alive outright, mainly because Yoda was 900 years old, and Luke doesn't really know anything about his species, so he's unsure whether Yoda was that old because he's just naturally that old, or if that was some sort of Jedi thing where they, can live to be much older ages. And that's sort of something that we're still seeing with The Mandalorian, trying to understand. Baby Yoda is still a baby at 50, so I guess that would sort of imply that the Yoda species they just age like that, but they're still not really willing to commit to an exact explanation.
And like I think in line with that as well, it's like Yoda is the most powerful Jedi or whatever. He's the best Jedi by whatever arbitrary metric. And so is Grogu really strong in the Force because he is the same race as Yoda, or is it something else? And they like still haven't really answered that as of now. This section also mentions Bail Organa. And, you know, I think it's something that you don't really think about when you're watching the original movies, but like, what is Leia the princess of? Like, and so they mention like, oh, well, there was this viceroy position and there was a dispute on Alderaan about who's the rightful successor. And there's other families in the mix. And I mean, it didn't really clarify anything for me. I walked away from it still being like, wait, so what is she the princess of? But at least they're trying to put some kind of scaffolding around it, because I still think in the prequels they never really flesh out like what exactly Alderaanian royalty is.
I think they've tried to explain it in some other expanded universe stuff. I don't know the exact details. That Organa was some sort of royalty, but then also happened to be a senator. Sort of similar to like Amidala becoming a senator, even though that was like an elected queen. So, you know, not a queen,
yeah.
but
The democratic monarchy.
yeah. But yeah, the reason we find out about this is that, lo and behold, Sabaoth was one of the Jedi that was sent to sort of mediate this dispute for succession on Alderaan, you know, because there are 3 planets in Star Wars, and
Yeah.
all the characters end up going to those 3 planets.
It seems unlikely because this is a second book, but I wonder if any of that plot thread carried over from it being an Obi-Wan clone. Like, so if some of the history between Bail Organa and the Jedi is about Obi-Wan specifically, I don't know.
Yeah, that would make sense. So Han is the one that really is proactive about trying to investigate Phalia and sort of figure out what's going on with Akbar, because, you know, based on Han's interactions with him, he's kind of assuming that Phalia is just straight up a traitor. And so he identifies the planet Nukov to be where they should start investigating, because he pulls up a list of all the battles that Phalia's Bothans participated in during the war with the Empire, and found that Nukov was the one place where they weren't actually ordered to go engage in a battle as not part of the main force, but just there was fighting there with Bothan forces that was sort of unrelated to the rest of the rebellions. So there must have been something else that they were protecting there. So Han thinks that if there's any dirt they can get on Phalia, that's where they should go. And I like that Han is coming up with these ideas and, you know, being the troublemaker that we know Han Solo to be. But I am a little disappointed that Leia's not really taking any initiative here, where she's supposed to be this leader in the government and, you know, active in politics, but she's not really doing much, like participating with the council or defending Akbar. Like, she goes and hangs out with Akbar just to keep his spirits up, but compared to the Leia that we see in the movies, that's always at the forefront of anything, it's kind of weird to see her take a back seat here.
Yeah, I'm like picturing her on Hoth directing troops, and then it's like, okay, well, yeah, she's pregnant and like now she has more responsibility as a political figure, but yeah, if anything, you would expect her to be more active in these scenes instead of just like kind of off to the side the same way Luke is, except Luke did it by choice.
Yeah, and she's also planning on jetting off to the Nogri homeworld with her unborn children, which is just seems like a really bad idea, and that's why Chewbacca is insisting on going with her. Luke goes straight to Nukov in his X-Wing, while Han takes the Lady Luck to Sluis Van to pick up Lando first. When they arrive, Han thinks he recognizes one of Phalia's aides and follows him, while Lando retrieves Luke from a local tapcaf. Han pursues the Bothan, but is soon held at blaster point by an unknown woman. While Luke waits at the tapcaf, a dispute breaks out between a Rodian and a Barabel over payment with Imperial currency. Luke is asked to mediate the dispute while Lando arrives to offer input, and he is able to resolve things when he recognizes Niles Ferrier and forces him to exchange the Imperial credits for New Republic ones. Just then, a siren goes off, signaling an Imperial raid. Luke tries to find Han while Lando returns to the landing pad to hide their ships. The unknown woman introduces herself to Han as Senna, and she is able to confirm his identity when Luke is spotted. Her people bring Luke to them, and Senna alludes to being part of a third party that opposes the Empire. They agree to meet her leader, but first must return to their ships in Lando. Senna's comrade Irenez goes with them, and they are able to fight off stormtroopers and leave the planet. In space, they meet up with Senna's ship, but a Star Destroyer is waiting. Luke holds off oncoming TIE fighters but is separated from the group and leaves for Jomark and Sabaoth. The Lady Luck and Senna escape with the aid of 3 dreadnoughts that emerge from hyperspace and hold back the destroyer. Ferrier is picked up during the raid and brought before Thrawn. Having a need for warships, Thrawn gives him 3 months to track down and steal the dreadnoughts under threat of death. Luke arrives on Jomark and finds Sabaoth waiting. He is disturbed after seeing Sabaoth use Force lightning to settle a dispute between villagers, but decides to stay to learn more about the Force and help a possibly sick Sabaoth. Alright, so Han and Lando arrive on Nukov, which is this rainforesty, overgrown jungle planet, and pretty much immediately recognize Phalia's aide just walking around. Coincidences aside, Borsk Phalia's aide is named Tav Bralia, which is just, we had the fake Dengar Roth named Gunnar Groth, and now the 2 Bothans we have are Borsk Phalia and Tav Bralia.
Yeah, they did the same thing, I think, with Chewbacca, or like the other Wookiees all just had like Baka in their name or something, right? Like very much not creative with the naming conventions here. I mean, it's helpful for me, I guess, to look at it at a glance and be like, oh, that's another Bothan.
Yeah, it didn't spend a lot of time coming up with those names.
Yeah, it's a little silly.
So Han and Lando separate because Han's going to follow Bralia and Lando's going to go meet up with Luke at the rendezvous point. And Han tells Lando not to call him on his comlink because he doesn't want the beep going off while he's following Bralia. And it just hit me while reading this that cell phones were not that common back in the early 90s. I don't know if the vibrate setting was a thing back then with the cell phones that were even available. This wouldn't be something they'd include in a plot point today, because the idea of not having a silent alert for a communication device would just be crazy. But I guess back in the early 90s, the only way you can hear the telephone is if it actually makes an audible sound. So
yeah, or like I think they're treating it like a walkie-talkie where it'll go.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, just it's fun to see how technology in Star Wars sort of changes over time, because it's sort of keeping up with like how modern technology has also changed.
Right.
And yeah, so when Han gets held up by Senna, she orders him to drop his comlink, and he tries to turn it on and set it down so that he can be monitored. And when she notices, she points out that she's not going to fall for the oldest trick in the book. And stay tuned, this will come back towards the end of the book.
So they go to another bar, and I whined about this in the last book. This time, Luke orders hot chocolate again, except this time it's mint hot chocolate. I don't know what Timothy Zahn's obsession is with making hot chocolate canon in Star Wars, but it's getting very irritating for me as a reader. It's such a small thing, but like I kind of miss, it's coming into relief now why a lot of these properties are like, and then he took a sip of his blue milk. It's like, oh, okay, because when you bring real world human drinks into it and like make a point of mentioning it, it feels really jarring compared to, like you said, the comlink and holograms and like all these things that are very universe specific. So anyway, I'm going to keep complaining every time this comes up. But
in addition to chocolate, mint is also now canon. So
yeah, it's not spice from Kessel. It's just regular mint from your garden.
Well, spice is drugs. It's
yeah. Well, I'm sure they have others.
Not,
I mean,
food spice.
But they use it. They just use it for everything, right? I mean, they yeah.
It's like cocaine.
No, I know, but they I still think they mention Kessel spice in other contexts in modern, like they just use it as drugs and food seasoning. Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, this whole dispute in the bar really just felt like a RPG sort of mediation side quest. And actually in like Knights of the Old Republic, there are several situations like this where you have to go talk to the 2 sides and then come up with some sort of resolution. But Luke comments that he wasn't really trained for any of this with Obi-Wan and Yoda. And I think it's interesting to point out that he got the really abbreviated Jedi course, which was mainly just focused on teaching him to chop Darth Vader's head off. Like all the other responsibilities of a Jedi weren't really the priority.
Yeah, like I don't know if front flips over a log taught him how to like resolve financial conflicts between individuals, but I mean, and at the same time, it makes sense. Like that, there's not much to mediate with the dark side. But it does kind of raise the point that, yeah, Luke is like supposed to be this Jedi master, but also has had like a really shockingly small amount of actual training on what the role and responsibility is of a Jedi, considering they were treated as the peacekeepers of the galaxy. Like, how does he fill that role?
Yeah. And, the way that this gets resolved is that he's somehow able to smell Niles Ferrier's, Axe body spray from the crowd because he just happens to be in the same bar after running into him on a completely different planet. Luke even points out, like, wow, this is really lucky that he happened to be in the same location of me, which I don't know if, lampshading it actually makes this any better.
Yeah, I mean, this begins that trend of like the Force guided him here. It's like, no, shut up. That's dumb. That's bad writing.
Yeah, I guess it didn't. He didn't have to be here for this scene to happen, so I don't really know why he was. It was interesting for me that the role of the Jedi is kind of played straight here, and generally trusted by the public, because I feel like a lot of the post prequel material and even some of sort of the surrounding stuff that came out with the prequels, a lot of it sort of questions whether the Jedi are actually a force for good, and a lot of time is spent sort of pointing out like all the flaws of the Jedi Order. So it was kind of strange to see a more naive take on, or a more simplified take on what a Jedi meant, because this is before we have to do a inspection and subversion of what the Jedi are.
Right. Yeah, I think the most recent example I can think of that is the Acolyte, where the point of the show, if there is one, is to examine the relationship between the Jedi and the rest of the world, and like how much of a force for the good they really were. But yeah, it makes sense that this book, which is coming hot off the heels of the original movies, like all they had was that one line from Alec Guinness in A New Hope where he's just saying, oh, the Jedi used to be peacekeepers. It's like, okay, what does that mean? I don't hate it. I mean, I think it works fine for the scene. I think it gives it a little bit more of that like space fantasy feel instead of just straight sci-fi. It was also funny to see they're discussing like currency exchange rates and how Republic credits are no good out here. It's like, I've heard that before from a certain flying blue stereotype. And then
yeah, and actually Luke does what Qui-Gon should have done initially and just found somebody to do an exchange for him with the Republic credits.
Yeah, instead of gambling slaves on races, like, yeah. And then, yeah, at the end, he like raises his lightsaber to his forehead in salute to mark the end of his judgment. I don't know if they're implying that he like read that in a book and that's what Jedi all were supposed to do, or if it's just something he came up with on the spot to be like, and that's the end of it.
Seems a little dangerous to hold the lightsaber like close to your forehead.
Well, yeah, he's not pointing it at his skull. He's holding it perpendicular. But
yeah, so while this whole bar dispute is happening with Luke and Lando, Han is captured by Senna, who's more just, interested to know why he's there. Braillia tries to have them execute Han before they can confirm his ID. And we find out that Braillia is negotiating on behalf of Phalia to bring Senna's group into the New Republic. And it seems like tricking them into murdering Han Solo would be like very bad for their negotiations in all of this. Like if you're in a business deal and then the person you're negotiating with tricks you into murdering LeBron James, I feel like there are going to be some overall consequences for what's going to happen. Like this is crazy on Braillia's part here.
yeah, I agree.
So the Imperials arrive. Everybody's sort of scrambling. Luke and Han go with Irena's, one of Senna's people, to go get their ships before they're locked down by stormtroopers, and they have to run up these stairs. And when they get to the top, Han is completely winded while Luke and Irena's are fine. Just what's Han been doing these last couple of years? Just sort of hanging out on Coruscant. But we get to sort of this little shootout at the spaceport, and it's cool to me that despite Luke being the Jedi with, his infinite wisdom and guidance of the Force, Han is still the one that comes up with this plan that gets them out of this situation. Even with all of Luke's Force abilities, Han is still the idea guy. And so the sequence is pretty interesting. They take advantage of the Lady Luck's beck and call, which allows them to sort of remotely operate it. So they're having it take off with its repulsor lifts and fly around the little plaza while the stormtroopers are there, distracting them. Luke is forced jumping into his X-wing and cutting off a restraining bolt that was placed on R2 with his lightsaber, and then they're shooting things up, and eventually they're all able to get onto the Lady Luck and blast off into space. Very similar to the Mos Eisley sort of shootout that happens in A New Hope. We're playing the hits here.
Yeah, it seems like they're doing this a lot. But again, maybe I'm just biased because I watch so many episodes of like the Clone Wars and the Bad Batch and all these shows where every episode is them doing a shootout trying to get to a shuttle that they stole so they can fly away and escape a Star Destroyer or something.
Yeah, I guess there are only so many like Star Wars set pieces that exist.
Yeah, it's tough that they're already burning through basically all of them in the first 2 books. One thing that stood out to me here was that they have there's like an inspection task force that shows up, and it's mostly comprised of Imperial Army troops. There are some stormtroopers, but it was interesting to see them be very deliberate about differentiating the army troops and the stormtroopers. Because again, in the movies, we only ever see stormtroopers basically anywhere. But now that I've watched Andor season 2, like they do this a lot too, where the bulk of sort of the day-to-day boring stuff is done by just like regular people in army clothes, and then stormtroopers are reserved for specific operations. And I think the implication here in the book as well is like stormtroopers are not, they're like the elite task, or they're just the more elite military force. You save them because we don't have infinite money anymore. We need to be strategic about where and when we use stormtroopers. But if we have endless bodies that can fill army uniforms, then like go ahead. In the ensuing space battle, Han asks Luke to just do the thing he did in the last book, which is use the Force to scramble the enemy pilot's brains so that they like spin out and crash into each other and make it easy for him to blow them up. And it was interesting because Luke this time says something to the effect of like, I don't think it's good for me to do that kind of thing anymore. And I thought that was good because when I read the first book, I was like, boy, that sure feels like an evil thing to do, is like brain poison your enemies so you can kill them easier. And so it is cool that they're kind of bringing that back and bringing it into question. I think that's going to play a bit more into the relationship that Luke forms with Sabaoth going forward, and like his weird takes on the Force and what it means to use the Force.
Yeah, and he says that, and he's like, you understand, right? And Han in his head is like, not really. I don't really get what you're talking about. But he just sort of accepts it, because I think at this point there's been so much weird Jedi and Force stuff happening with Luke that Han is just kind of like, this is just par for the course. Like, I'm never going to understand what's actually going on with him. That's just part of being a Jedi, and I'm not going to try to think about it too hard. So Luke is able to hold off a TIE squadron by himself, which is, a pretty impressive feat for a single X-Wing. But I do like that he's not just pouncing on them and wiping them all out with a single X-Wing, because I feel like, this is more in like the Clone Wars and Rebels shows, but the Jedi pilots, or even just like the crew of the Ghost, are so much more skilled than the enemies. And when you get in these space fights, it's like, 15 TIE fighters showed up, we're just going to gun them all down with no issue. But the way they talk about it, Luke handling a squadron by himself is still seen as this huge effort, even though he doesn't actually, it's just a draw.
Yeah, I think the best way to feel this for yourself is like, go into any match on Star Wars Battlefront or Squadrons and like try to not get killed right away. Like, it's really hard to take on a whole squadron of fighters by yourself. And even if you have the Force, that's like going to be kind of ridiculous. So yeah, I am glad that they sort of bring it back down to earth a little bit.
Yeah, so these 3 dreadnoughts pop out of hyperspace that are allied with Senna right after we mentioned the dreadnoughts from the Katana fleet. So something probably happening there. But they're able to hold off the Star Destroyer by using ion cannons. And we only get to see a little bit in Empire Strikes Back, but ion cannons seem to be the most overpowered weapon in all of Star Wars, and then they just never get used except that one time that, you know, the ground-based turret is able to disable a Star Destroyer. I guess it's only for like 15 seconds or something, but most of those transports get away just because it intermittently fires into space and the Star Destroyer just can't do anything against it. And I don't know, it just seems like such a more powerful weapon than normal lasers if it can do stuff.
Yeah,
like
well,
this.
this is the fundamental problem with so many pieces of technology in Star Wars is they never articulate the trade-offs. If you were to tell me, I mean, at least with the ion cannon on Hoth, the trade-off is this thing is like 50 stories high and it's stationary. So like, cool, we spent our entire annual budget building this thing and we can use it in one battle and now the Empire has it. And the other thing is that, like, well, yeah, just in terms of trade-offs, like putting that technology onto a, you know, relatively small space vessel, you know, does it consume more energy? Does it use up ammunition? Do they have a limited number of shots? They never really say. So then it becomes a question of, well, why don't they just use this all the time? And then I think the second thing is, in the movies, capital ships don't fire a single shot the entire time during space battles. I think the only examples I can think of, or at least not at each other. So like in the opening scene of A New Hope, they're firing the lasers at the Tantive 4 and whatever. I think they do at the Millennium Falcon and the asteroid belt chase. But like in the space battle where it's capital ships shooting at each other, like you never actually see them fire. And I think this idea that these big cruisers have ion cannons attached to them is something that came after. We see it in video games all the time. And yeah, I don't know that you can just say like, oh yeah, now we have ion cannons everywhere, because yeah, they would be just way too overpowered.
Yeah, I mean, like the implied weakness is that it doesn't do any damage on its own. It just basically freezes the enemy ships. But it's like, okay, then we use the other gun and we can blow it up.
Just keep shooting them with the ion cannon. Like, yeah.
But yeah, I think all in all, this entire sequence basically from the spaceport into space was really well done. Did a good job of sort of increasing the tension. Like first, they're just trying to get out of the spaceport. They're trying their different moves. And then they blast out of there. And now, oh no, we have to deal with a Star Destroyer, which again is kind of like the Mos Eisley scene. But it does show that you don't need some huge threat to be imposing, that it's just a single Star Destroyer, and we don't need this sort of like escalation of stakes beyond a certain point to keep tension high.
I would even just argue that like that restraint is what allows it to be good. I think at a certain point if you have too much going on in the scene and you can't visualize it because you're reading it on paper and there's like too much to coordinate, then the quality starts to suffer. But when you have these small scale sequences, it's a lot easier to visualize it. You can more creatively come up with different ways for the ships to interact. And I don't know, yeah, just some other books I've read where you have these like massive war battles and it's like it might as well have just been a single sentence where they say, and then they fought.
Yeah, and then one last thing from this section is that in the aftermath, Thrawn arrives at Nukov and sees that Han and Luke were there, and he hadn't predicted them being on Nukov. He thought that they would go investigate the bank transfer, so he had a whole trap laid out for them there. And it just shows that even with all of his predictive abilities and all of his intelligence, Han Solo is just the one person that he has zero read on and can't predict what he's going to do next. So Han is that wild card, as Zahn would put it. So Luke escapes that battle and heads straight to Jomark to go meet Sabaoth, or look for Sabaoth at least. And so he meets Sabaoth, and Sabaoth is a weirdo immediately. Immediately starts talking about how Jedi must be in control of everything and everyone, really sounding like a Sith. And Luke kind of is just nodding along, being like, I have no idea what's going on right now.
Yeah, and what I really liked about this was that even though he does pretty much instantly recognize that something is very wrong, his first instinct is to help Sabaoth because he wants to help him. That's like what his character is. And he kind of asks himself, like, is this the best use of my time? Like, maybe I could be out on the front lines fighting or doing something somewhere else. But he sort of realizes, like, no, these are the moments that define a Jedi. Like, not some grand act of blowing up the Death Star, but like finding the humanity within individuals and reflecting what he did with Darth Vader and how that sort of helped resolve bring balance to the Force. That's like really what he's trying to do. And even if he doesn't quite understand what that is going to achieve right now, it's probably a good idea to do it instead of detaching himself from the individual concerns of people on the ground.
So even though he is resigned to help Sabaoth, he does internally question whether Sabaoth was actually able to evade the Empire, or if, his current state may be as a result of being captured by the Empire. He also speculates to R2 that maybe Sabaoth went insane because all the other Jedi from the Outbound flight died and have just been haunting him this entire time. Because he knows that Obi-Wan came back as a Force ghost, he's wondering if Sabaoth has just been talking to ghosts for the last 30 years and it's just completely driven him insane, which is a possibility with Force ghosts that I don't think I've ever considered, that somebody keeps showing up that you don't want them to. And I do think that the fact that Yoda kind of spoke in riddles and put on this sort of nutty attitude when he first met him has sort of made Luke unprepared to deal with another crazy master, because the whole time he's like, well, I guess Yoda was kind of weird when I first met him, and maybe this is just some other thing that Sabaoth is doing, and he's possibly not fully understanding how much of an issue it is that Sabaoth is off it. This has been part 1 of our discussion of Dark Force Rising. Check out the conclusion in part 2, which is available right now.